¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes, maestros y maestras del Programa Nacional de Inglés que nos acompañan en esta segunda semana de actividades de esta jornada virtual nacional que como tema central tiene el de la metodología de la enseñanza del idioma inglés en diferentes niveles y diferentes contextos. Permítanme comentarles que el día de hoy y esta semana estaremos trabajando con un nivel más, no necesariamente avanzado, pero más diverso de propuestas en temas pedagógicos. En esta ocasión, quiero presentarles a la licenciada Ivette Pompa, directora de Servicios Educativos del British Council México, quien a través de esta representación va a dar paso a nuestro siguiente ponente y les quieren mandar un cordial mensaje desde el Consejo Británico. Ivette, bienvenida.
Hola, buenas tardes, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, estoy muy emocionada. Para el British Council es muy importante formar parte de estas jornadas de capacitación. Quiero agradecer al licenciado Sark por la invitación y por este espacio que nos dan ahora en las jornadas de capacitación virtual para asesores externos y docentes PRONI. Es un gusto para nosotros estar aquí. Tuvimos la oportunidad de colaborar desde la semana pasada, que dio inicio a las jornadas, con dos colaboraciones, de hecho, que realizó la maestra Susana Ramírez, en donde ella, enfocada en el tema que comentaba el licenciado Sark, que era la revisión del programa de estudios, bueno, ella pudo participar y contó con muy buena participación e interacción. Estamos muy emocionados por ello y se los agradecemos. Susana habló mucho sobre el programa y los retos de implementarlo en los contextos reales de los docentes. Ambos conversatorios que ella tuvo la oportunidad fueron muy bien recibidos, tuvimos muy buenos comentarios y opiniones muy relevantes. Ahora, en las siguientes 2 semanas, que están enfocadas en metodología en general, y bueno, en este conversatorio que ahora yo les voy a presentar, quiero también aprovechar la ocasión para comentar cómo es la participación del British Council a lo largo de estas 3 semanas de jornadas. Nosotros tuvimos el gusto y la oportunidad de poder tener presentaciones en vivo. Vamos a tener además 4 presentaciones grabadas. Hemos compartido 11 artículos y algunas publicaciones, así como también vamos a realizar actividades que puedan integrar y consolidar la comprensión del contenido que estamos compartiendo. Como dije al inicio, para el British Council es de suma importancia poder formar parte de estas jornadas, ya que para nosotros en México es una prioridad poder apoyar el acceso equitativo a una calidad de educación. Y sabemos la importancia del inglés en México. Es por eso que ayudar a que los alumnos puedan aprender un idioma de calidad podrá brindar a los niños y jóvenes de este país una oportunidad para tener una mejor oportunidad en la vida. Es por eso que a través de los años hemos realizado diversas actividades con el Programa Nacional de Inglés y de la mano de diversos estados en el país. Hemos realizado, por ejemplo, hace algunos meses estuvimos llevando a cabo una sesión de conversatorios que llamamos The Future of Education. Estas se llevaron a cabo durante junio y julio y pudimos hablar precisamente enfocado en estos temas de enseñanza del inglés. Tuvimos la participación de 3 coordinadores estatales de Chiapas, de Colima y Guanajuato. Ellos hablaron sobre el uso de plataformas digitales. Posteriormente, en julio, tuvimos la oportunidad de conversar, invitamos al licenciado Sark a que platicara con nosotros sobre la importancia del desarrollo profesional continuo del discente de inglés en la educación básica. Bueno, y además, como ustedes sabrán, durante muchos años hemos llevado a cabo nuestra conferencia anual que se llama BBELT, The Best of British English Language Teaching. Esta conferencia está enfocada a profesionales de la enseñanza del inglés y busca proveer un espacio, una plataforma para comentar o compartir las mejores prácticas de la enseñanza del inglés. Y bueno, en el marco de BBELT de este año, que se llevó a cabo en febrero, tuvimos la oportunidad de realizar un día antes un foro de discusión, un diálogo, donde nos reunimos con el coordinador nacional del programa de inglés y con la mayoría de los representantes de las coordinaciones estatales. En esta ocasión pudimos explorar o profundizar un poco más sobre el futuro de la enseñanza del idioma inglés en educación básica en México. Y quiero compartirles algunas de las opiniones o principales preocupaciones que logramos recolectar en esta sesión, en donde se resaltó que es muy importante poder obtener una integración exitosa de las tecnologías de la información y la comunicación para mejorar el proceso de enseñanza del aprendizaje del inglés. También se resaltó la prioridad que debe darse a asegurar una cobertura del 100% en todas las escuelas del país y de esta manera asegurar que los niños y niñas tengan acceso a la enseñanza del inglés de calidad y poder así apoyar a reducir los índices de inequidad y desigualdad social. Otro punto importante que fue resaltado es la necesidad de mejorar las condiciones laborales y la formación de los profesionales o los profesores de inglés. Se mencionó también que es importante hablar sobre presupuestos para capacitaciones y desarrollo profesional para los maestros de inglés. Debe existir un mejor respaldo, reconocimiento y acompañamiento de las autoridades federales y más apoyo de las autoridades estatales que permitan hacer más eficiente las reglas de operación del programa. Se resaltó también la importancia de tener contenidos basados en los contextos educativos y en los niveles adecuados del dominio del idioma de los estudiantes. Y finalmente, bueno, se mencionó que debe haber una visión y una estrategia a largo plazo en las políticas públicas y en las estrategias estatales y de ser posible contar con un departamento para la enseñanza de inglés dentro de la Secretaría de Educación Pública. Derivado de este encuentro y de estas conversaciones que nosotros pudimos tener en febrero de este año, fue posible que elaboráramos un estudio que vamos a compartir en breve y donde nosotros pudimos concluir lo siguiente que les quiero compartir. El Programa Nacional de Inglés representa un logro y un acierto en el sistema educativo, ya que a través de prácticas sociales del lenguaje permite a los niños, niñas y adolescentes de todos los sectores sociales y económicos de México tener acceso al aprendizaje de una lengua extranjera y a través de experiencias individuales y colectivas practican el lenguaje en situaciones e interacciones de la vida real con lo que han aprendido en clase, haciendo el aprendizaje algo significativo y trascendental. Para tal fin, es importante seguir analizando al PRONI como un instrumento de movilidad social, de una educación más justa y de excelencia. Este estudio que nosotros pudimos realizar es un diminuto esfuerzo para conocer desde el ojo de los responsables federales y coordinadores estatales cuáles son las barreras que han afectado al programa, así como los impulsores que fortalecen y que han permitido al programa consolidarse a nivel nacional. Del mismo modo, es importante identificar cómo otras instituciones y organizaciones, tanto públicas como privadas, pueden ayudar a la implementación y operación exitosa de este programa. Finalmente, visualizamos con este estudio cuál es el futuro de la enseñanza del inglés en México, que sin duda alguna es una herramienta para la transformación social y económica de nuestro país. Quiero compartirles también que tendremos en septiembre un conversatorio con Carl Reed que estará dirigido a asesores externos especializados y docentes del PRONI, y en breve les compartiremos la fecha y un horario. Bueno, quiero ahora tomar la oportunidad para presentar a nuestro siguiente ponente, el cual él dará una participación enfocada en el desarrollo profesional continuo. Él es parte del British Council y se los voy a presentar en breve, pero como estará hablando en inglés, o toda la sesión será en inglés, entonces voy a permitirme hacer la presentación en inglés. Su nombre es Graham Stanley y ahora les platico un poco de su background. Graham Stanley is Head for English Education System Leads for the British Council in the Americas. He's based in Mexico City. Graham has a master's degree in ELT and education technology and over 20 years of experience working in the education system as a leader and a manager, project manager, teacher, and teacher trainer. His specialty is the use of technology for learning and professional development. Graham's areas of expertise include learning and introductional design, training and development, e-learning, project management, teaching and teacher development, writing, and public speaking. He's the author of the Handbook for Teachers, Language Learning Within Technology, published by Cambridge University in 2013, which won the English-Speaking Union HRH Duke of Edinburgh Award for ELT Books of the Year in 2013. He's also the co-author of Digital Play, Computer Games and Language Aims, which won a British Council ELT Innovation Award for Teacher Development. So I'm very pleased to present now Graham Stanley, which is a great colleague. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of the session and the rest of the weeks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Yvette, and thank you to everybody for coming to today's presentation. I'm going to ask for my slides to be shared with you all, and then we can begin talking about continuing professional development in the digital age, or as I've called it, CPD 3.0. So can you share my slides, please? Whoever is in the background, ready to push a button. There we go. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. I will be talking today, as I said, about continuing professional development. I think as English teachers, it is very, very necessary for us to take our own, pay a lot of attention to how we develop on our own, and we can have support through lots of different ways. And I'm hoping today that I will give you lots of ideas of how to do that in the digital age. So in the age we're at the moment, and as we all know, with the pandemic making things more difficult to meet face-to-face, well, a lot of our CPD has to be done online. So I'll be taking a look at that, and hopefully I will be able to enthuse you to continue with your professional development the way that you want to do, and take advantage of all of the offers that our Connected World has. Because I think nowadays we have so many different options for CPD, from collaborative expertise to engaging with action research, MOOCs, which are massively online courses, teacher activity groups, and lots of other things that I'll be talking to you about today. Now, before I continue, I should say that this is is meant to be a very interactive presentation. What I would like you to do is, at various points, I'll be asking you questions, and what I want you to do is to read what's on the screen and then put into the chat your answers, so I can get an idea of your background and your answers, and that might affect how I continue with the presentation. So the first question is, what is your context? What are you? I know you all work for state school education in Mexico, and I know that you are all involved in basic education, but are you primary school teachers or secondary English teachers, or any of you teacher trainers, or any of you doing something else? If you could put that into the, apologies, if you could put that into the chat, then I'll be able to see it, I think. So I'm starting to see Mario was the first to answer, and Mario is a secondary English teacher. And we have Luis Carlos Reyes Betancourt, who is a primary school teacher. More secondary school teachers, I think, than primary school teachers. The other thing I'd like you to do is just, as well, put in how long you've been a teacher for, so how many years experience, which would be good to know. I'll be talking about my own experience and my own experience with CPD during this presentation as well. But first of all, let's look at what CPD is. Now, CPD stands for Continuing Professional Development. And as it says on the slide, it's a planned, continuous and lifelong process So this is something that we teachers should be doing all our careers, basically. And through it, you can develop your personal and professional qualities, improve the knowledge, skills, and practice that you require for teaching. And it also improves your professional autonomy, your performance in the classroom, and ultimately the development of your organization, the school, and the learners. And that is adapted from a study that the British Council commissioned in 2011, but it's still very relevant now. Thank you. Keep sending your answers in the chat. And I can see we have 22 years, Luis Enrique, 10 years, Lilia Limpia. So lots of interesting information that I'll keep an eye on. We'll also be collecting questions for the end, which I will answer, and the team in the background will be pulling out some of those questions to ask me at the end of the session. So I'm going to frame this with my own perspective on CPD, and I've divided it up into 4 different ages, if you like, which are 4 different aspects of my own career. The first being as an English language teacher, the second as a senior teacher, and also I got involved as a teacher association coordinator then. And then around 7 years ago, I became a project manager. And then about 1.5 years, I moved to Mexico as the English for Education Systems lead for the British Council, and have a more sort of general perspective across the Americas. So I'll be talking about my experience of CPD during those 4 stages, if you like, in my career. So that's me and CPD, and that's what we'll be talking about. Now, what is CPD for you? Because it varies a lot depending on the teacher and your context, I think. So your own development, is it more decided by your institution, by the school, or by PRONI? Or is it decided more, do you think, by you and the other teachers that you work for? I mean, it might be just you, or it could be the teachers that work in the school that you work in. You get together and you decide to do your own CPD. If you put in the chat which one of these applies to you. Is it something you do on your own? For example, Paula Mercedes Rodrigo Flores says that it's something that she does more on her own. Or is it not something you do? I hope it's not the last answer there. Or if it is, I hope by the end of this session, it will be one of the other ones. But anyway, what I'd like you to do now as well, although we can't talk to each other with voice, if you can reflect on your experience of CPD, and if you want to put in a sentence or 2 in the chat as well, that would be very useful. So Ariana's already done that, and she said, oh, it's just sped up the screen, so I can't see it now. Let's see, what was it? Something she does. Sorry, Ariana, I missed it. So if you put it in the chat, and then I'll try and catch some of the answers. So I've got lots of C's, A's, and B's coming up, which I think it doesn't surprise me that it's a combination. I think every teacher, that is the case. So let's move on. Now, if I think about me, when I started as a teacher and in my career as an English language teacher in the classroom, I used to work in Barcelona in Spain for many years. And this is a picture of me when I started, or maybe I was a little bit older than the picture, but more or less. Now, what was CPD for me? Well, I think as a teacher of the British Council, we had a number of different options. Things got very interesting, I think, once the idea of frameworks came in. And I'm going to share with you some of the frameworks that are available. There are many frameworks available for teachers. What I think a framework does very well is it allows you to think about your CPD in a structured way, where you are and where you want to be. And then hopefully you can get guidance and help and support about how to get to where you want to be in your professional career. Now, this is one One framework that you can see on the screen, the CASA framework for professional development, that was suggested by Donald Freeman in an article he wrote way back in 1989. I think one of the things you should realize as an English teacher, as any teacher really, is that once you finish your course as a teacher, whatever that course may well be, you're only starting on your journey, really. It shouldn't feel that you have finished learning how to be a teacher. I don't have to say this to you all. You all know this anyway, but I'll say it anyway. But also, it's something that you're just beginning to really get the practice that will convert your skills into being something exceptional for your learners. And these frameworks are particularly good for these. So here we have 4 parts to it. We have on the left-hand side, attitude, skills, awareness, and knowledge, things that teachers need to develop. And the idea is that you look at this framework and you write what your strengths are, you write what you think your areas for improvement are, and then you come up with an action plan. And you could do that with colleagues, for example, to help you decide where you want to go. It's a pretty basic framework, but it nevertheless is better than having nothing, I think. And it's still very interesting to have. And Isabel agrees with me, I think, in particular, it's important in this day and age to develop as a teacher. Right, here's another framework. And this is a bit more complex. I'm not going to go into it, but it gives you an idea of the kind of things that have been developed, this one through educational psychology. Now, I think, although very interesting, and you could spend a good hour trying to work out how you could adapt or make use of this framework that was produced by Zimmerman in 1990. But for me, I think one of the great things that happened to me as a teacher was the British Council had developed, when I was a teacher, a more simple and easy to use framework. And this is what I'm going to spend a little bit more time looking at now. It's called the Teaching for Success framework. It's meant to for teachers to be able to self-assess. It's the one on the left. The one on the right is actually for teacher educators. So there's a similar framework for teacher educators to help them improve as well, because we all need to develop, whether a teacher, school leader, or a teacher educator. And I'm going to look a little bit more at this. There are 12 professional practices, which are the headings around the top of the circle. And then the bands, if you like, are important as well. They represent, similar to what Freeman represented there, we've got awareness, understanding, engagement, and integration. And the idea is for each of these professional practices, you as a teacher decide where you think you are. To give you an idea, awareness just means you've heard of it. So if it's something, if you're starting out and you've heard of inclusive practices, for example, then you would mark on the band, the outer band, where inclusive practices is, and that would signify that you started becoming aware of inclusive practices in the classroom. Then as we move further into the center, it means you have more experience and more awareness of it all. We get understanding, means perhaps if you had understanding of using inclusive practices, then it's something that you've started adopting and introducing into your classes. The next one is engagement. Engagement means you're fully engaged, you're fully aware of what is available, how you can use inclusive practices, for example, in your classroom with your learners, and you doing it on a regular basis. And then perhaps integration right at the end. That means not only are you engaging with this and very aware, but you probably could teach other teachers, I think, to use inclusive practices. So that becomes when you become almost heading towards becoming an expert on the subject. So that's the idea of the framework. And what you would do is you would cross off where you were, where you thought you were, because it's a self-assessment, on the circle, on the wheel, or whatever you want to call it, and the bands. And then it gives you a visual idea of where your strengths are and where you might want to choose to improve. Now, it doesn't mean that you should choose to improve where your awareness is. It depends on your context or whether you think that's particularly important or interesting for you. What you might choose to do is start to build up some of your skills where you're just aware of something. And particularly if you're not aware of a particular practice, then that would be a signal that this is something I really need to find out about and do. But you also might want to think, look, I really want to become an expert in this area. I see that it's something I do very much have a lot of knowledge and experience with, and I could help my colleagues actually know more about this. That would indicate that you could offer to give a presentation or do a workshop for your colleagues and to help them improve. Now, if you're head of a school, then you could ask teachers to do this and take these in, and then you could see where the main interest was or the main deficiencies were with all the teachers. And that might help you decide on what training to do. So with the British Council, we take this to an even larger extent, is that we can look at schools across a region or across a country. We can ask teachers to do this, and then we can analyze the data, and based on what we see the interest is or where teachers need the skills, then we can suggest to a Ministry of Education what courses to run. And that's what we do a lot. I think it's very important that for Teaching for Success to win, to be effective, for CPD to be particularly effective, I think it really needs to be something that involves you, the teacher, to help decide and help your school understand what you need to become more effective in the classroom. That's when it becomes more relevant and more effective, which is what this is all about. Here's just a zooming in of some of those practices. I'm not going to spend much time on them, but you can see the idea a bit more. And you can download this from the website that is there. And I think these slides will be made available to you after the presentation. Maybe I can stick a link on the YouTube if no one else makes them available, but you don't have to scribble down all of the links. You can get them later. And this is the one for the teacher educators. As I said, everyone needs to be thinking about their CPD. Okay, now, one of the things I started to become aware of as a teacher was there was an increasing divide between research and practice. So when I was studying to become a teacher, I would see articles and get to know more about the evidence about what works in the classroom that researchers at university were providing. And that I felt was very important. But as soon as I was in the classroom, my whole life was dominated, as I'm sure yours is, with actually preparing for classes, delivering the classes, trying to become a better teacher through practice. And I think the research tended to be a little bit sidelined because I just didn't have time. And a lot of the time I didn't have access to research that was particularly relevant to what I needed to do in the classroom. And I think this quote underlines that, is that there is something that somebody needs to do to bring research more into the classroom. Now, there are a number of ways that are you're able to do that. The word research need not be, for example, a dirty word, if you like. Research can be all sorts of things. You can do your own research, for example. Now, there is something that we promote, again, the British Council among teachers, called action research. You may have heard of. This is called exploratory action research, which is all about trying to empower teachers, you as the teacher, to be able to think about something in your classroom that you want to change, then to explore what it is. You might identify a problem, or you might have a question about your learners. Why aren't they speaking to me? Or why is it that they don't do their homework? Or why is it that I have to keep repeating things? Whatever it is, it's something very specific to your classroom practice. Then the idea is that you explore that a bit further. You can ask your students about things. You can analyze and reflect, and then you come up with a plan to make a change in your classroom. The important thing about this is not only do you change something in your classroom, which is, I think, something that teachers always do, and I'm seeing lots of comments in the classroom related to this. Pacheco says, never stop learning if life never stops teaching. Exactly. And Jimena says, CBD is something that I can do on my own and also decide by institution. Answering those questions, keep on answering those questions, and I can keep an eye on them as well. But also, I think the important thing there is to be able to try and measure what you change in your classroom. It could be a survey. It could be you're trying to get an idea of whether your students, after making a change, speak more or speak better, things like that. And to be able to observe, measure it, reflect on it, and then implement it or try something different. And that's action research. That's something I started as a teacher and I really got into. And since I taught many years ago in Barcelona, the framework for doing action research, this framework for doing exploratory action research, is much easier to follow. And we are very much at the British Council promoting this. And we have collected, not only we have a handbook for any groups of teachers or schools who would like to implement their own action research, but also we've been running some projects and collecting evidence. At the end of these projects, which are called the Champion Teachers projects, where teachers actually do a lot of exploratory action research in their own classrooms, they then present their findings in the form of a poster to their colleagues. And you can also learn that way through these presentations, but also we collect them in a book. And for those of you who are interested in more and want to know what kind of form these changes take in Mexico itself, you can download that book from the website on the screen there and find out more about doing this. It might be something you want to try in your own classroom. Okay, now we're back over to you again. What is your approach to CPD? I've talked about frameworks. I've talked about doing things that perhaps you're unfamiliar for you. But what kind of approach do you do? Do you use a framework? If you put in the chat, if a framework is something that you would use, I'd be very interested to hear. And if you do use a framework, then if you can put the name of the framework that you use in the chat, that would be interesting as well, because there, as I said, there are lots of different frameworks. Do you just do what you feel? I mean, sometimes you don't want to be so structured about what you do. You follow your nose. There might be a particular class that has a particular interest and you want to learn how to do that. I've done that a lot. That's what took me towards using computer games, for example, and trying to explore through action research what worked in the classroom with my learners. I would try something, I would self-reflect, I would ask the learners about it, I would see their reaction, and that led me to become fascinated in that area. What about you? So if you could put that in your answers to those questions in the chat, that would be good. Maria Teresa says A and C, so a framework or just what she does at the moment. I think those are the two that I particularly like, although many times in my career as a teacher, I've actually benefited from the training that has been suggested to me by the school that I worked for. Let's move on. My second stage, if you like, and again, there's a picture of me in my 20s, long gone now. I fondly remember them though. was as a senior and a teacher association coordinator. And I'll be talking a little bit about those two roles now. Now, there's an infamous quote by Michael Fullan there. I'm going to read it out just so it has the full impact, I think. Now, Michael Fullan in the year 2000 said, "Nothing has promised so much and has been so frustratingly wasteful as thousands of workshops and conferences that led to no significant change in practice when teachers returned to the classrooms." Now, that's quite a provocative statement, and it's very provocative for me to be saying that during a workshop that I'm giving to you. But I personally don't really believe that, although I do sympathize with it or empathize with it, where it comes from. Because I have to say that I have sat through training courses that haven't been particularly relevant to me. But then, on the other hand, I have to say that I have been to training courses that have been fundamental to how I developed as a teacher. So I kind of can understand where he comes from. Ironically, I saw Michael Fullan a couple of times present at conferences. So I don't really think that he believes in it completely. Otherwise, he would stop going to conferences and giving presentations, wouldn't he, I think? But I think one of the things I think is important about this is that I think as teachers, you learn more when you fully engage with something. And to fully engage with something, you have to be really, it has to be really relevant to your context, to your own classroom practice, what's happening in your classroom. And it has to be something that you could see as able for you to do as well. It's not something that a wizard trainer can magic up in front of you and then you think, but I would never be able to do that, or my students would never do that, or I couldn't do that. So I think that is important. And as teacher trainers, any of you who are teacher trainers, I think you have to think of that when you give teacher training as well. So your turn. Have you ever been on a very good course? Perhaps there's something you've attended recently because of the lockdown. There's been a lot of webinars about remote teaching, teaching online, about trying to help learners through these difficult times. Is there anything that you've seen where your practice really changed through something you learned on a course or a workshop? And if so, what was it? Perhaps you can write into the chat if there is anything you can think of at the moment that you think particularly improved or led to improvements in your own practice. That would be interesting for you to share with us, I think. And I'll be interested in revisiting this this chat log to be able to read your thoughts later. I'm going to move on because we've got a lot to deal with now. One of the other ways I would recommend that you can do professional development is, rather than receiving it from a so-called expert, well, you can collaborate with a group of teachers in your own school, and you can get together, and there can be several different groups in a particular institution, depending on the size, and you can decide to focus on a particular thing that you have in common that you want to learn from each other about. This, when it's structured, is called a teacher activity group, or a TAG. And when I was a senior teacher, I got involved in helping to organize these. We asked the teachers in our school to get together to say what they were interested in developing about, and they would get together once a week or once every 2 weeks, depending, at a time which was convenient for them, and they would have a discussion group. They would take notes, and they would not just meet to chat, but actually decide on an agenda. Okay, we're interested in learning more about using websites for listening, for example, which was one of them. we're all going to go away and we're going to collect what we come across that we think works, and we're going to present to each other our top 3 websites that would work for listening. That was an example, for example. Then someone might come in and say, look, I found this really interesting article about recent research that has been done. Why don't we all read it, and then we'll get together again next week and discuss it. So that's a tag. And I think it helps a lot if it's motivated by the teachers. You, the teachers yourself, really want to learn something about it. And rather than trying to learn by your own, to have a colleague to help motivate you, to stimulate you, to brainstorm, to bring their ideas in, can really help and amplify the effect of this type of professional development. Okay, then there are professional organizations. Now there's IATEFL in the UK, and this is my own personal special interest, if you like, was in learning technologies. So quite early on, I got involved in the Learning Technology SIG at IATEFL. And we are actually starting now with BBELT SIGs. So rather than just inviting teachers to come and join us once a year for the conference, which, you know, I've had the pleasure of going to twice, and I think it's an amazing event with so much to see and do and so much professional development going on, but that's only 2 days. So the idea is that we want to extend that. And this year we have launched two BBELT SIGs. One of them is the Learning Technology SIG, which will, you know, it got a little bit delayed because of the pandemic, but we'll be relaunching that very soon. If you're interested in knowing more about that, then put it in the chat, and one of my colleagues in the back of this webinar will pick up on that and share, I think. And then the other one is the Teacher Research SIG. So if you're interested more in action research, then that would be the one to join. Now, as this workshop is based on my own experience, I've shared what I've done as a senior teacher and as a teacher association member, which has helped me grow a lot through attending and organizing. But what about you? Are any of you members of teacher associations or communities of practice? Perhaps you are, but you've never thought about it before. Perhaps you belong to a group or several groups on Facebook. Facebook is a very good place now to connect with other teachers and share ideas. Perhaps that's how you do it. Perhaps you do it on Twitter. Or perhaps you belong to a face-to-face physical teacher association that's local to where you live. I would love to hear if that's the case. So put it in the chat. Or perhaps it's not something for you. Perhaps a TA, a teacher association, is not something you think you would particularly like to be part of. I do recommend it if you have the opportunity, and then I think it is something where you can really, in a very enjoyable way, mix with colleagues who you don't directly work with, but connect with other people in other areas and learn from them. I've learned a lot through doing that. So what happened to me? Well, I moved to Uruguay and I became a project manager on a very large project, collaborating with an organization called Plan Saval, where the British Council teaches online to thousands of children in state schools. My whole idea of CPD changed because I then was responsible, or partly responsible, for CPD across a whole project in a country. And so that was a different perspective for me. What happened? Well, we started documenting the kind of things we were doing that worked and presenting on it. We started learning from the teachers who were teaching remotely and trying to provide solutions for them. And finally, we collected a lot of those stories and we commissioned articles of research and teacher narratives to be able to put together a book which you can download, all about the kind of remote teaching we did in Uruguay. Now, that was remote teaching that is different from the kind of remote teaching that is done at the moment because of the pandemic. that was remote teaching into classrooms and schools where children were together with a local classroom teacher. So a lot of the book isn't relevant to the remote teaching that some of you, I think, may well be aware of or even doing, which involves you being at home and teaching children at home. That requires a very different approach. Although some of the things in this book are definitely relevant to that. As far as CPD is concerned as well, the skills required for teaching from home via video conferencing, a bit like what we're doing now, and the skills required teaching to a class are very similar. Perhaps the things that are different are classroom management, for example, or materials, or working in groups is different. So one of the things that I did, which again used the frameworks that I presented earlier that the British Council has for Teaching for Success, is we had to adapt them for the new form of teaching. And again, we're having to do that as well. One of the interesting things that we found, though, was that not a lot changed. So good teaching is good teaching, whether it's face-to-face or remote. And I think you should keep that in mind, particularly if you have been challenged recently, as we all have been, in trying to reach children who are not physically in your classroom. You have skills. You shouldn't feel too much pressure about having to adapt them, because when we looked at it, there wasn't that much adaptation that was required. A certain amount of adaptation in not being physically present in the classroom with students, but most of what makes a good teacher still stands. So I thought that was really interesting to find that, because I didn't know going into that whether it did. And with a colleague, we actually looked at this and wrote an article for a book that was published by the Learning Technologies SIG, all about adapting the CPD framework and activities and looking at what makes a good remote teacher. The things that were different were obviously use of technology. So using technology becomes a lot more higher on your priority list if you're teaching remotely, that's obvious, but also classroom management. As I'm sure any of you who have tried to teach online recently have had to sort of deal with all sorts of different classroom management issues that you haven't had to deal with in a face-to-face physical classroom, where you don't have the students all in one room. You might have other adults in the room, or you might not. That might be a good thing or not, etc. I don't have the time to go into it now, but it's a fascinating subject. One of the things I think is important to be aware is that you may feel as a teacher, I know a lot of teachers feel that their students are more digital savvy or more fluent in the use of technology than they are. And that can cause anxiety and can cause teachers to feel a little bit, oh, I don't know what we're doing. The students know more than I do. But actually, what you have in your advantage is that the students, very few of them, if any of them, will know what digital pedagogy is. And that's the most important thing. So they may be very familiar with a lot of their tools. They may use WhatsApp all the time. They may be watching YouTube, playing games, etc., etc. So they may be doing lots of things that you're not doing. But if your focus is upon using the technology, if you have to use it, to be able to reach students effectively, then that's something that you will get to know and the students won't have a clue with. So they may know how to use the technology, but they won't really know how to use it for learning. That's something you can actually help them with as well once you become familiar with it. So again, it's an area for CPD. What I'd like to ask you now is related to the digital world, this online world that we all have been thrown into, if you like, and whether or not you actually do any online CPD. Have you been doing any online CPD? You're doing it now, of course, but apart from this, have you been doing a lot of it? Is it all been self-directed? Has it been something that you've done with other teachers or on your own, etc.? We've got quite a few Bs here, some people doing it. Got C. So Patsy does a lot of online CPD, mainly Bs. Okay, and then your experience of it. What works, what doesn't work. I particularly like this type of CPD. I've learned a lot from listening to other people, but I also do like the self-access courses as well. And I'll come to this because I think it's something that you should be interested in knowing about. Now, there are so many opportunities these days for doing professional development. We're also spoiled for choice, really. I think what you need to do is really decide on what is important for you to know. One of the best ways I found of doing CPD online is through a platform that the British Council actually collaborates with for some of, but not all of the courses on there are British Council courses, of course, just some of them. It's called FutureLearn, and they do what used to be called, but is frequently not being referred to as MOOCs. So there's massively online open courses, MOOC, and usually they're all free. I think you have to pay if you want a certificate, but otherwise you can join as many as you like. They're free to join, they're free to follow, and they're fascinating. And they also have some of the best learning design that I've seen. The interface is very clear. It's broken down into little bits, so you could just do 5, 10 minutes, 15, half an hour, whatever you decide to do is enough. You could do it in a coffee break. You could do it at the end of the day, just 20 minutes at the end of the day, and very shortly you'll finish the whole course. So there's short videos, there's interaction, and it keeps your progress. And you also have the opportunity, as it says there, 1,171 comments. You can decide whether to engage with the other people doing the course at the same time as you or not. So if you don't have a lot of time, then you just do the course. If you want to explore the subject a bit further, you could ask questions, you can read comments. And the interesting thing about the way that this is designed is that the most relevant or interesting comments are voted up by the people taking the course. So if somebody puts something that is particularly interesting with a link to something that's particularly relevant, the people taking the course that are reading that click on the like button, and that comment moves its way up to the top. So when you get to the course, which may be sometime after lots of people have started joining it, and you decide to look at the comments, you should see the most interesting ones first, which I think is a very clever thing. And you don't have to scroll all the way down to people saying hello, 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 and where they're from. So that's something I recommend. In this type of learning design, there are lots of infographics, there are summaries, and there are also links for those people who want to go a bit deeper, which I think is very important. So if you find a particular part of a particular course that you're interested in, the course should give you links of where you can go to read more articles, to watch more videos, to find out more about the research behind it. And I think most of these, if not all of them, are all evidence-based as well, which I think is particularly important. These are not just some ideas that people have had. They're actually based and trying to bring, as I said before, the research that has been done at universities back into the classroom, but to make it more accessible for teachers, which I think is a very interesting thing to do. Because I think as teachers, we need to have the certainty that the things that we're doing in the classroom are actually based on evidence, and they're going to have a positive effect on the learners we teach. I think that's very important. Finally, and I'm coming to the end, I think I've got about 5 minutes left before questions, so I'll hurry this section along. That's a picture of me on the beach in Tulum last year. I wish I could go to the beach again on Tulum one day maybe, or any beach really. I'm sure some of you were able to do it because you live by the beach, but I don't, being in Mexico City, but at least we've got some lovely parks here. That was created with an app that shows what you're going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years. So fortunately, it's not what I look like at the moment, but it's what's coming down the line. So the next stage of my career or my life. Let's look at what I've been doing in my current role as EES lead, or English for Educational Systems. And my brief in this job is across the whole Americas. So I find it fascinating to be able to compare and support colleagues, not only in Mexico, but in Venezuela, in Uruguay, in Peru, in Argentina, in Chile, and other places. And also through this role, I'm connected to the British Council's work globally as well. So I'm able to bring things from other regions to be able to share with my colleagues across the Americas, which I find fascinating as well. So one of the things that I think was very interesting for our region and has particular relevance to Mexico is some of the research that has been done across the Americas by this organization called the Dialogue. And the Dialogue researched across the Americas in a number of different countries. And in 2017, they published this report, which you can download. And they found similarities that, you know, there's a lack of teachers in our professions. I'm sure you all know, lack of sufficiently well-prepared teachers. And I think that is very importantly tells us that more CPD is needed for teachers to be effective. And then also collaborative expertise, which is when teachers get together and they, particularly, for example, an English teacher with a subject teacher, and they learn from each other and they try to help each other. Or someone from business with a teacher, or someone from, for example, in your case, a language academy, sharing experiences. They get to know more about what kind of context you're teaching in, and you get to know some of the things that they know that you perhaps don't know. This is collaborative expertise. And doing that, I think, is very important. And we have a number of programs across the Americas, the British Council that is, that takes advantage of that, the biggest one in Colombia. And then the other thing is lack of data. So we really need to know more about our context, what is needed, what, you know, the level of the students, what is needed about teachers, CPD, what teachers need, but also what equipment there is, what kind of needs there are for equipment, for infrastructure, all sorts of things, data. And that's why monitoring and evaluation is essential. And it's a big part of any of the programs that British Council do. We make monitoring of evaluation 10 to 15% at least of the program, to be able to try and measure and try and learn from what we're doing, so that the next time we do it, we improve upon it. And that, as a teacher, I think is something you can do as well. We talked a little bit about action research. Well, you should be measuring and monitoring what you're doing and trying to work out not just what your opinion is about what you're doing in the classroom, but what the students say, or anything you can observe that is a little bit more objective than how you feel about it. I think that's very important and interesting. Now, the things that were suggested in this report include development of the learning community. So teachers coming together is always going to help. You know, if you're trying to do something as an individual teacher, you're not going to be able to do it as effectively as when you're connecting with other teachers. So connecting with other teachers in your school, in your area, in your district, in your country. This, for example, opportunity to connect with other teachers, I think, is fabulous. To any of those types of communities on Facebook, as I said before, or anywhere else, the teacher associations, the SIGs, where you can connect with other teachers and learn from them, I think is going to help you a lot. The great news is that there is a lot of innovation and change taking place across the region. There is so much happening that is changing in schools. So many teachers are doing some fabulous work now. And I think we all need to get to know more about what they're doing. So again, publishing, if you have a blog, publish on a blog, sharing, presenting, the posters, the action research, conferences. You know, if you do think you've got something that is working, then please share it with your colleagues, and I think it'll be much appreciated. I'm not going to talk about Talis because I've run out of time, and I've been told through WhatsApp that I've got to 1 minute left. So I'm going to skip ahead, but Talis is something that I think would show you some evidence about what's been done in schools across the region, and some of the things that teachers feel in general are important to them. It can be an interesting read if you've got the time, because I think you'll really empathize with some of the findings there. So I recommend that, again, if you want to know more about what's happening in other countries. So finally, what do you think are the CPD challenges for you personally? What are your CPD challenges? What are the challenges specific to Mexico, the Mexican situation? What are the things that you feel you really need as a teacher? How do you need to develop in your professional development? And do you think they're similar? Well, you could find out by looking at the reports that I said. Perhaps that's of interest. Are they similarly globally? Well, some of them are. The things that are quite interesting is that many of the preoccupations, I think, that teachers have in Mexico are preoccupations that people have in other areas in the Americas, but also globally, which unites us and also then makes us think, well, if I can connect with teachers in other parts of the world, then really we can find out what they're doing and do something similar if it works. So what's your opinion? How do you think you can make a difference? And what do you think needs to be done to tackle some of the challenges there are? So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope I've given you a flavor of what CPD 3 or CPD in 2020 looks like. Hopefully there have been some new things for you here that you can look into further, into more detail if you're interested in there. Some ideas. I hope some of you at least will be enthused to try out some of the things I've suggested. And now I think it's time for questions. We've got about 15 minutes. Excuse me. So I hope that you have questions. Otherwise, we'll be just sitting here in silence for 15 minutes. And I'm going to hand over to, I think, one of my colleagues, Liliana, who will be...
Yes, thank you, Graham. I mean, the audience has some questions. There are many, many questions, but before I move forward, I would just like to thank people from different states, cities, locations. I don't want to mention all of them because I might miss some, and apologies. I've been trying to, hello, Ulises. Yes, I've been trying to say, to take notes. So basically, I mean, if I miss one, apologies. But basically, thank you to Nayarit, Yucatán, Celaya, Durango, Sinaloa, Ciudad de México, then Ciudad Valles in San Luis Potosí, Chiapas, Morelos, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Iztapan de la Sal, Puebla, Jalisco, Guerrero. Wow, everybody is here. And what I did, Graham, there were several comments. But before we get to the comments, I think the questions are key. And I grouped the questions into 3 themes. That's what I could actually do. The first one is very relevant because it was very recurrent, this question. And I think you know, because you've been talking about technology, I'm sure you know what the question is. Basically, someone like Ricardo Lagunes, like Yvette Rojas, like Maria de Lourdes Diaz Chavez, they asked about what if there is not so much access to technology? What's the options? Yeah. You've been talking about technology and the use of technology, but their concern is, this is fantastic, but what do I do if I don't have, or my students don't have that access to technology? And I know you have the answer, so that's why, or at least you know where we can find answers. So that's why I wanted to pose this question to you.
Yeah, well, I think, it comes up all the time. My particular special interest is using technology. So that is probably the most asked question of all. It's fine for you to say use technology, but we don't have technology to use. And I think it's a very difficult thing. I think, if anything, the recent school closures have drawn into, have highlighted the importance of things like the internet for 21st century education. That's something that countries, Mexico, we all, I think, are going to struggle with. Access to the internet is becoming more important. It's almost as if it's becoming necessary in a lot of ways. So it's something like, you know, it's becoming important in the way that not quite as much, but electricity or water, access to fresh water, things like that. For education, most of now what we can get for free requires internet access. So an investment in infrastructure is something that will, you know, is really interesting to consider. Now, that's not something that the teachers can obviously solve, unfortunately, but it is something I think that governments, ministries will have to be moving towards and trying to fight for the country to move ahead in the future. But on the smaller scale things, I think there are lots of things you can do. I think what you need to do is not worry about what you don't have, but to try and use what you do have. So in other words, I know there are all sorts of fabulous programs that try to look at this and use TV, try to use radio, try to do something locally with actual print copies of things. There are also circumstances where a teacher will find that all of their students can access mobiles. Mobile is probably the most popular technology at the moment that a lot of people have. So I think a lot depends on knowing your learners and knowing what they have available to them. And as Lily Esquivel says, yeah, in other words, use what is available. It's as simple as that and as difficult as that. Because first of all, I think the most important thing you can do as a teacher is you need to find out who your learners are. Know your learners. What are they? Who are they? I'm sure all of you know that anyway. It doesn't, you know, it's obvious thing to say, but I think it is important to get to know them and to know what you don't want to do is to suggest using something that someone doesn't have access to, because that would then divide the class. So yeah, there's no easy solution, but I think you have to try and find your own solution based on context. Once you've done that and you know what you can use or what you do have available to be able to bridge that gap, then you can start connecting with other teachers. That's what I think you should do. Other teachers who are also in the situation that you're in will be able to help you. And there are lots of examples of that. I have an example in Peru, for example, of one of my colleagues in Peru was telling me that in some cases, teachers are actually making photocopies and distributing materials to students' houses. Now, if that's the case, then there are places where you can get the materials. You don't have to create the materials yourself. So I think it's very difficult to generalize on a solution, but I think the solution is definitely there if you look for it. It's not going to be ideal. It's not going to be as easy as connecting to the internet, of course, but there are solutions and they are workable. And I think learning from other teachers would be my suggestion of what to do.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Well, just with technology, just for a second, I had a hiccup there and I left you, but I know when you were on, so thanks. In fact, there's another question that is very relevant. Probably, I don't know if we will have time for two more, but this is relevant, and this was presented by Jose Alberto Nájera. And his question was, taking into consideration this current situation of the pandemic, could you, Graham, share your thoughts on the importance of blended learning, flipped classroom? Probably this goes together with other questions that were in the chat that talked about, the methodologies. It's not just using the technology, but also applying the different methodologies. Oh, yeah. So that's why I thought it was a good question.
Oh, it's an excellent question. Definitely. I think, methodology should take precedence over technology. Technology is like, if you're going to use technology, and you can, we've established that some of you can, some of you can't, then I think the important thing is you want, as far as possible, the technology to disappear. Now, a UK academic called Stephen Bax talked about this as what the objective of any teacher using technology for education is normalization. And that's when it just sort of fades into the background. So in other words, you press a button and it works, and you concentrate on the teaching and the pedagogy and the methodology. And some of the things that that were mentioned there in the question are very relevant. So you've got blended learning and flipped learning. For those of you who may not be familiar with those two terms, blended learning is when you do a combination of some face-to-face and some online. But it can also mean a combination of synchronous, i.e. live, what we're doing now is synchronous or live, and asynchronous or not live. Now, email isn't live. You receive an email, you don't receive it and respond at the same time, not necessarily, that it was sent. You do it afterwards, and that's asynchronous. And a lot of the things related to forums, etc. So blended can also mean that. So I think if you're going to be teaching online, then you should definitely consider what percentage is asynchronous and what percentage is synchronous. You don't have to, in a school, for example, school setting, you have a class and most of it is synchronous. Most of it is you with the students in a physical setting teaching live. Some of it is asynchronous, if you like. That's the homework. That's what you ask students to do in their own time after class or before the next class. And I think it's very important for you to consider that. How much and what is it necessary to do live, and what can the students do in their own time outside of this live setting? For example, you might not want students to sit there and read for 20 minutes while you kind of sitting waiting for them to finish. Flipped learning is when what I said about the asynchronous part of face-to-face classes, which can also be true of online classes, is the homework aspect. It's when you ask students to do something after the class. And we all know it's good practice to give a little bit of homework after each class, or at least each week. Now, you might want to flip it, which means give the homework before the class. And in other words, the students do something that you would maybe normally do with them live, but it makes more sense if they do that on their own before they have the live class. That's the flipped classroom. And these are two very interesting approaches. Now, the big question there, and why flipped learning usually falls flat on its face, is how do I get my students to do it? And if they don't do it, what do I do? Now, we don't have time to go into that, but I think there are lots of ideas and methods and strategies. If you're interested in it, I would suggest you look up Synchronous Online Flipped Learning Approach, SOFLA, SOFLA, that an academic in the States called Helene Marshall has developed. And that's a very structured methodological approach to flipped learning that has been very online, that has been very well developed, that helps you deal with some of the questions that I've, some of the issues that come up when you're trying to flip your classroom. So I'll stop there because I'm sure there's another question.
Great. We're out of time. There's another webinar starting. What I think is, why don't we do this? I mean, you're going to share your presentation. Maybe you can add the extra links that we thought of. We have also added a lot of links here, especially to download the books that you mentioned, because the teachers were saying, how do we get access to those books? And all the links that you mentioned so that people can access different ways of CPD. And we will pass you more comments and more questions that we collected from the chat, and we will try and give answers to every one of them. I just want to thank everybody for attending and give the mic to Prony, either Licenciado Sark or Juan Carlos Roca. I'm not so sure who's coming in, but thank you very much, Graham. I think it's Juan Carlos who's going to join us. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Thank you, Graham.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody. I hope it's been interesting.
Muchas gracias, Graham. Muchas gracias, Liliana. Y muchas gracias a todo el Consejo Británico por habernos dado este apoyo y por el apoyo constante que nos están dando. Bueno, muchas gracias por atender a esta participación, a esta presentación. y nos vemos a las 3:10 en otra presentación ahora por la Universidad de Cambridge y la Universidad de Michigan. Que estén bien, hasta luego.